Okay, thank you for joining us, and we'll kick off now. So good afternoon, welcome, and thank you for being here. We're very much looking forward to today's discussion to address a topic that asks the most important questions around how we can make sure all vulnerable children in our society are able to flourish, where we are going wrong and what we can do about it. So my name is John Copps, I'm from Mutual Ventures, and today I'll be having a conversation with colleagues Sal and Gail from Leeds and Chris in Darlington. They'll say hello in a moment. So the future of children's social care in England is in the spotlight following the government's response to the care review and its ambition to create a system for children with stable homes built on love. So the question is, how far are we away from that aim now? What is holding us back? And have we got our balance of priorities right in terms of how we think about the structure and the delivery of children's services? So today we'll look at those questions through the lens of child welfare, a concept that looks across the whole of a child's well-being, development, lifestyle and safety. And we'll talk about the family valued approach, which was developed by Leeds City Council and is now used across many partner local authorities. Our speakers are here to give their views, but I can speak to them, I can speak for them and say that we all approach this with a sense of humility. So together we'll have a discussion, we'll share some ideas, and we'd really like to hear from you at the same time. So a note to use the on-screen Q&A facility to answer any questions you might have. And if you leave your name, we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. We'll also be sending a link to the copy of this recording afterwards. So let me turn to our panelists who will introduce themselves. If we start with Sal.
Good afternoon, everybody. Sal Tariq. I'm Director of the Leeds Relational Practice Centre, formerly Director of Children's Services in Leeds, where I spent the majority of my social work career over the last 30 years.
And Gail.
Hi, I'm Gail Faulkner. I'm lead consultant with Leeds Relational Practice Centre. And before that, I was a head of service for 10, 11 years in Leeds.
And hello, Chris.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Bell. I'm the Assistant Director for Children's Services at Darlington Borough Council, where for about the last 4 and a little bit years, we've been implementing the family valued approach as a trailblazer in partnership with Leeds and the DFE.
Brilliant. Right. Well, we're going to have an open conversation here. And as I said to those of you watching us, please do submit things through the Q&A if you wish to. So to kick us off, I want to start and ask Sal. So when you stand back from 30 years of being in social work and in children's services, what do you see, and what's your assessment of where we're at now?
Okay, well, I mean, I've said 30 years. It's probably about 29, really, and around the virtual table, there is somebody else who's got more experience than that as well, and I'll just put that out there at the beginning. I suppose when I look back and think about when I started in as a qualified social worker, I was 25 years old. It was not untypical that people at that sort of age and older were coming into the profession, because there was a requirement at the time around age limit. So that is something that is, I guess, is very different. It also felt a bit like a political act in some ways, to be coming into social work, and certainly in terms of the training development and my early years in social work, this idea about structural disadvantage was at the fore of our understanding and analysis in terms of the work that we did with families. You know, this understanding that poverty has a significant impact on people and their ability to care for their children. You know, we've got up-to-date research now through Bywaters et al. About the link between poverty and the likelihood of children coming into the care system. But also we talked a lot about radical social work, feminist social work. Anti-racism was, you know, explicit as an approach, and I think that whole idea around not pathologizing individuals and having a broader understanding of how people ended up within in the circumstances they did, allowed us to operate in a way that was focused on help and support, much more than on processes, which I think we get caught up in. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. I think the other thing that struck me when I thought back about this was just the localized approach, the localized nature of the work that we did. So when I was a team manager, I worked in one postcode of Leeds, in Leeds 12 in Armley. There was one high school, 3 primary schools, 2 health visiting teams. They were my best friends in terms of there being a localized safeguarding network in an area. I mean, it wasn't, don't get me wrong, I don't want to paint this picture that everything was rosy and fantastic. And when people talk about good old-fashioned social work, I can give you poor examples of good old-fashioned social work as well. But I think that when people do talk about that concept of good old-fashioned social work, I think they're talking about those elements of it that were very, very much about our values, that were very much about a community approach, and this idea of really wanting to try and help and support families. I think what happened was, though, that there was probably a lack of structure and discipline. Would be fair to say that there wasn't any kind of form of discipline about how something might come into children's services and then how that would get allocated. It kind of went much more by a random approach to need, and the highest priority, most urgent things tended to get allocated and responded to, and then things that might have been medium or lower level sat around not acted upon. And so and I guess probably something around trying to develop much more of an evidence base, much more of a practice evidence about doing the sorts of things that we have some evidence of their impact. And so I think in the attempt to try and bring those things to bear, which I think was the right thing to try and do, I think we went too far. I think that probably over the last 50, particularly, I mean, maybe not as much now, but certainly 10, 15 years ago, this kind of drive around processes and timescales has had a really detrimental impact on the quality of service and the children and families receive, because we started to measure quality. We started to measure timeliness as a proxy for quality, and so we also set up our systems and our services in a way that meant that we could get things done in a timely way, not necessarily paying attention to the human side of it, right, the relationship side of it. So this idea around like assessment teams and care management teams, I think, has been really detrimental to longer lasting relationships between social workers and children. So I think the idea behind trying to bring some of that discipline and order was the right one. We went too far. We've lost our way a bit in terms of how we structure and relate to children and families, and we've gone away from more localized approaches.
So Sal, you started on talking about values, and so if I'm interpreting you correctly, it's not that values have come out of social work or anything like that. It's the fact that there's other things that have sort of become, perhaps taken some of the attention away from a values-based approach. I think that if you're under enormous amount of pressure in terms of the work, we've also had long periods of significant austerity. So currently poverty is much worse than it has been at different points over the last 30 years, but also the services that are there to try and support families through that have had searing reductions in the amount of services that they've got. And when you are in those sorts of circumstances, you balance that against the very public eye on children's services, the demands that the public now have around the quality of children's services, and you start to create a risk-averse culture. Risk has become the primary focus rather than help and support. And what we know is that
10% of the stuff that we deal with is willful, serious harm of children, and 90% is families struggling in conditions of adversity with challenges such as adult mental health problems, domestic violence, substance misuse, poverty, racism, misogyny, all of those things. But when you're under that kind of pressure, people shortcut to processes, and when you're being risk averse, you make sure that you've got all your processes taken care of, and that the bit that is about relationships and building trust with families to help create change can take a bit of a backseat. It can be that time gets pressurized, and so you get a bit of a making sure all of my processes are done because I don't want to be criticized for that.
Let's come back to that balance.
Really effective stuff around.
Let's come back to that balance of 90 and 10%. You said, but so Gail, based on your 30 years plus experience of social work, so Sal talked about sort of scrutiny and measurement and some of these targets being the right thing to do. Actually, we've just perhaps gone too far with it or not implemented it properly. So how do we get values back at the forefront of social work and children's services?
Not an easy question, I don't think. I mean, I think that teams and individuals have to think and discuss values. It's absolutely right what Sal says about, the pressure of getting things done means that we don't have just the luxury of sort of saying, how are we helping families? Are we doing to families? Our families, I think we have to think about, here we have, we all know families living in poverty, health inequalities, insecure housing, real difficulties. And they should be able to look across and say, oh, there's the children's services. There's a department in my community entirely to help children. How lucky am I? How great is that? But what is it that they get from that children's services? Most families and people at the webinar might disagree, fear what we have. It's state intervention in people's lives where we go in, we fill a form in, we have an escalation process. Sometimes we might even be thinking about gathering evidence rather than saying the family are the expert in their own situation. My primary concern is to build a relationship of trust so that I can help them and so that they might make changes, and so that children's services does actually be a helping service, not a kind of state police service, which is really problematic for families. And I don't know how we've got them. I mean, it's interesting when Sal says about, 30 years ago, it wasn't everything. Sometimes I remember referrals that might be a bit tricky, but not high risk, would be sitting in a real basket for weeks on earth. We don't ever want to get back to that. But we have to, as a profession, just think about what are we trying to do? Are we trying to help? And we've really got away from that. I was reading something in a local authority recently, and a mother was a drug taker, and that was problematic for her children. So what would we do there? Try and build a relationship, try and say to her, maybe there's some services locally to help you. And do you need help to get there? Are they acceptable to them? Are they accessible to you? But what we did is make a request to have hair strand testing. And that's a really value-based approach. Now, I'm not saying that that is up and down the country, but those are the kind of things that we need to just ask ourselves. Is that what we're doing? Is the children's services helping? Because, of course, if we don't help that woman, we'll end up with her child in care, maybe. And one of the discourses we've got to have is, does care do harm to children? Does, if you are a child who comes into care, are you likely to keep your friends? Are you likely to keep your school? Are you likely to be loved? or not. What is your life going to be, and is that harmful? And that's a discourse we absolutely have to have, and we don't have that. You don't see that either written or spoken about so much, which is something we certainly try to do in around the work we've done with Family Valued, and just thinking about what does family offer and the wider family. I'm sure I've not answered that, but
no, that's great. We've got loads of strands coming out there. So before we pick up on some of them, let's go. Chris, can I ask you, because you and colleagues are running children's services in Darlington.
Yeah, sure.
And you've been on a journey over the last, I don't know, 5 or 6 years, haven't you? So how does this balance between process and values sit with your experience in the journey?
Yeah, my experience might be slightly, or certainly the context of my experience might be slightly different. So whilst we recently had Ofsted visit us, so I've probably aged a good couple of years in the last couple of weeks, but I wasn't a practicing social worker 30 years ago. But what I was involved with social workers and with children's services department as part of a family that fostered back then, and it was just interesting, reflecting on Sal's findings, and certainly through that lens and through living with young people in my home who were in care at that time, none of them were upset about their assessment being slightly out of time scales. I can tell you that for a fact. What they would be upset about was someone arranging to come and visit them and not turning up at the time when they did. They would positively remember the time that the social worker went the extra mile and brought a birthday card for them unexpected. So there's just something real about when we really reflect on kind of Sal's point about what is important to families. And I appreciate that's through a very narrow lens of children who are in care at that time, but they are still children who are in receipt of services and support. And I just think the things that Sal described as measuring isn't the things that were important and are important to children. And so it does really challenge us in terms of, so why are they the things that we're measuring if they're not important to children and families? And it's children and families who this support and input is all around. Then it really brings into question why we measure things in the way that we do. So there was that, but also just to pick up a strand on Gail's point, and I think it's a really pertinent one, that sometimes we do take the approach that children coming into our care doesn't cause them any harm whatsoever. And I would argue in every situation it causes an element of trauma. Of course, in some situations, the trauma that will be experienced by a child coming into care will not outweigh the trauma and the harm that they would suffer were they to remain in a harmful situation, either at home or with their families. But I do think there's that old-fashioned approach of we do need to balance all of the decisions that we make as social workers and practitioners with children and families. And I think over years it has become easier to view children coming into care as a risk-free approach. So we eliminate a risk and create a risk-free approach. And this is not me advocating against or for children coming into care. I just thought Gail's point was really pertinent, that the jobs we're asking workers to do, which is extremely challenging and tricky and nuanced, is to make those really fine judgments about best interests, which doesn't involve eliminating risk. It needs to manage it, and it harks back to Sal's point that how do you do that if you don't have a relationship with a child or a family? I would argue it's impossible to make those decisions in the best interests. I think in terms of the approach that we've taken and our experience of it, so we were found as a local authority to be inadequate back in 2015. And the response really to being inadequate is very much following the approach that I think Sal was articulating earlier, in terms of, so if you're inadequate and things are effectively broken, which is what we were told at that time, then you look at what you can measure. So we became very good at assessment timeliness and things being recorded in the right way and everything, measuring well, and that had a positive impact to a certain extent, in that we did see some improvements. I would argue basics are important in terms of our work, but it wasn't really helping us to measure that quality and understand what the experiences of children and families accessing our service beyond is their assessment recorded on our case management system within the timescales that the government set. So our work with Leeds in 2019 was very much focused on going that step further and going from the compliance elements into the quality of work, and the key to that being, a relational approach. So, Sal and his team came and gave us a load of guidance and support in terms of how, as leaders, we could model a high support, high challenge relational approach. And it fits into that. If we're going to expect our services to work with families in a relationship-centered, high support, high challenge way, then going back to your earlier question of how we do that, in my view, we create an organisation where social workers and team managers experience that from the people who they work for, and that empowers them to remodel that behaviour, and then they remodel that back, and they give us as leaders that challenge and that support approach, and it becomes almost contagious, really. And so that's what we've tried to do, over recent years, in terms of really focusing on culture and just talking about it, constantly challenging ourselves. That element of your culture is as good as the worst behaviour you're willing to tolerate is absolutely true, and something we've really held on to as we've been on our journey in terms of what do we want for our organisation, because what we want for that is what we're likely to see happening in terms of our involvement and support with children and families. But I think built on the premise absolutely that Sal's described before of, I'm absolutely bought into that 90-10 approach. I think it's absolutely right that we have a small number of families that, the notions of disguised compliance and real ingrained harm and individuals who are seeking to harm children does happen, and we have processes. But I think there's been an element that the system's been built on the assumption, we'll assume that all families fall into that category until we prove otherwise, and there needs to be that balance. So in terms of how we balance support, we should be putting, in theory, 90% of our overall budgets into supporting families and 10% into the interventive type of approach, and that's, I would suggest, a long way from where we are currently.
So Sal, we called this webinar Reimagining Child Welfare, which is a phrase I've heard in Leeds a few times, or lots of times. Could you, and both Gail and Chris have talked a bit about family valued, so I think you better tell us a bit about what that is, and how it fits into this debate we're having now.
Well, I mean, just to pick up on a couple of bits, I mean, one of the things I would say is that part of this is about getting to a position where you are clear about what you're prioritizing. So in a sense, it's not, nobody here is advocating that you don't undertake any assessments, right? Nobody here is saying that you can take as long as you like over assessments. But what we're saying is that you prioritize building a relationship and creating trust. And when you put your energy into doing that, then you will be, in effect, undertaking analysis, making judgments, making an assessment. But don't let the form and the process lead your work. Let the relationship building and engendering trust lead the work that you are doing. Because in that way, actually, what you're going to do is get much closer to whatever risk there is. Because if you are more humane and relational in your approach, people are more likely to be open and honest with you. And if they think that they're going to get some help and support from you, they're more likely to be honest with you. Whereas if they're frightened to death of the processes that you keep using to escalate them through, like a referral and an assessment and a child in need plan, child protection plan, and straight through to care proceedings, then that in that fearful approach, all they've got is fight or flight. And so there's something about those things, but also then how you talk about those things. So we would say, is it reasonable for a family to expect within 9 weeks to understand what we think, right? Which is your assessment timescale. Well, of course it is reasonable. And therefore, when you start to try and tackle some of these issues, you're doing it from that context, not doing it from the get that form filled in no matter what. It's much more nuanced than taking just a processed approach. The other thing,
Sal, how much bravery does that take if you're running children's services? Because Chris talked about the situation where Darlington were in inadequate authority, so focused on the easily measurable, the process. Like if you're in that position and you're saying to us, focus on the relationships and just trust that almost everything else will then flow from that. How difficult, I'm just thinking how difficult that is for some people.
But it can be difficult. I mean, I think one of the terms that we coined was this idea about holding your nerve. And in some ways, we work with a number of authorities now in terms of their improvement. And one of the things that I keep getting thrown at me by them is that we need pace. And I'm like, you've been doing things at pace for 3 years and got nowhere. This is something about stepping back and saying we have to get all the foundations in place effectively in order that we achieve that compliance that you're trying to do, but we don't have the unintended consequences of just escalating people through processes, that actually you achieve that compliance through using an approach that is going to ensure that you have quality as well as ticking off the quantitative things. So I suppose in some ways it takes a level of bravery. I guess you could describe it like that. And other people sometimes do describe it like that. I just think it takes a shift in the logic and a different way of thinking about it. It's not moving away from some of those things. And if Ofsted come in and have a look, then we've shown that taking this approach, we're not criticised for it, that it is a safe and appropriate way to do it, because what we're doing is getting closer to the heart of the difficulties that families are experiencing, and then helping and supporting them with those things. So I think that's one of the big bits that I would put forward. But also I think there's something about how trying to move away from this idea that we can go into families and fix the issues that they've got, and we've got to move away from that idea that we're the expert and we're going to go in there and fix it. We should be much more, particularly in that 90%, in that position of facilitating that change, because we know that when families come up with their own solutions to the difficulties that they are facing, then those solutions are much more likely to deal with the core issues. They're much more likely to be effective in dealing with the problems that they're encountering. And importantly, they're much more likely to be sustainable. So that it's not and that's truly working with, isn't it? Where you are kind of saying, here's the help and support that we can provide, but here are our expectations. We want to see change. We want to see children's needs being met. These are the challenges you've got. Let us help you with those. But this has got to be the direction of travel, rather than thinking that we go in and say, you get this fixed, or we're taking your kids away in a very punitive fashion, in a shortcut fashion. That's not sustainable change for children, and it doesn't get to their best outcomes. The other point I would make is that, like, if you get to the point where actually much earlier on, before we're getting into care proceedings and child protection processes, if we are more effectively meeting children and families' needs in that space, then what happens is that less children, safely and appropriately, less children come into the care system, right? So you've already got less children coming in. Then if you've taken this approach that we have through Family Valued, which is about seeing family as the greatest underused utility of the 21st century, then what you do is you say, where those children have been through that process and do need to come into care, let's have the highest proportion possible placed within their family and community network, right? Then you've got a small proportion left out of the total number of children who need to be in foster or residential care. And in that context, we might be able to do a bit of a better job of looking after those children and improving their life chances, because we have only got those children that really need to be in the care system. And so you have this whole approach across the journey of the child that says, let's meet their needs as they arise, because that's going to be the most effective way to prevent escalation. And so you have to set up your systems to do that. You can't use families not engaging as an escalation on the whole, in my view. What we should be doing is saying, I am not able to engage, because that then makes us think about how we're going to do that differently. And these family-led approaches and family group conferencing in particular really take you into a space where in that 90% of that we've talked about, that there's a different level of engagement that takes place. And once you've got that engagement, you can build a relationship, build trust, create change.
So let's talk about some of this in the context of the government's response to the care review and what's happening, because some of the key things in there were family help, family group decision making, a focus on kinship care. So those things seem very consistent with what Sal's just said. And Gail, is that your view? Is yeah?
Absolutely. It's just just the words family valued, family help, and stable homes built on love is just to read of those things is value laden in itself, because what we're saying is we need to help people have stable homes. Of course, what will be the challenge is how we move from what we have now to that vision, how that's driven, which is really important. Can we get away from a process-led, investigative, child protection kind of focus to a help and support? And I think that's something that we've been doing at Family Valued, trying to introduce, trying to talk to colleagues about. We have to be optimistic about that. I think some of the detail is perhaps a bit challenging, sort of, the specialist teams, how will that unfold, the multidisciplinary child protection teams? But with the correct values, with the focus on relationships and communities and localities, as Sal says, there's every reason that we will be able to achieve that and give families the help that they need, rather than what we have at the moment. I think I work a lot in the field of domestic violence, and everybody who's listening to us today, there will be domestic violence within children's services. There'll be referrals, many referrals, thousands. And what we have largely is working with usually women, often mothers who are victims, and we hold them to account for certain things, for keeping the man out of the house sometimes, and we have to do better. So if we can move that away from a child protection process down to family help, multidisciplinary, community-based, skillful relationship, listening services, that has to be better, because we are we're failing families at the moment with the way that we are being involved in this area and many others.
But
John,
how do we get that?
I think as Gail says, there are the details to be worked through, and obviously there are pathfinders that are going to be trying to work through what might be most effective. But I do think, just like Gail's just eloquently described there, I think this idea of making family help central to what happens in the care review is really, really important, because if you create a really effective family help service, then I think what that means is that the threshold at which we get into formal child protection processes like child protection conferences and care proceedings is higher. Because I think that we are too easily jumping to those processes because we have not effectively engaged families earlier in the process. And if we can get a family help service that does that, then it starts to take a much more welfare approach with as we've said, I keep going back to the 90%, then you are going to shift that dial on those that find themselves in those formal processes, and hopefully those are the ones entirely the ones that you would want to see in there, but also the other aspects of the care review around the promises for children in care, as I described earlier, become much more possible if you've got an effective family help, an effective kinship service. And we should be aiming for 50-60% of our children in care being in kinship arrangements. When you get to that sort of level, then you can start to do something about the quality for those children that are actually in care. And one of the other, going right back to the 30-year thing, one of the other things that I think is in the care review, and we'll see how it comes out, is this idea around the family network plan, where there is a emphasis on material support to families. So I think that one of the things that has that has happened is that there has been a shift in some of that providing direct material help to families. But during the pandemic, we found evidence to say that where we helped families materially with things, they were more open to discussing the other issues that they had with us, because they'd seen us as a more helpful service rather than one to be more frightened of. And there's some strong evidence about actually material help, financial, material help, white goods, all of that stuff that people struggle with. Getting those things sorted means that you're leaving families in a much better position to be able to care for their kids, not just physically and practically, but emotionally, having the emotional energy to be able to provide the love and care that we need for all children. So I think I think there's lots in the care review, if you get into the detail, that you might critique, but actually philosophically on the whole, I think it's entirely in the right direction. And as Gail says, thinking carefully about how we implement it gives us a real opportunity to make the kind of changes that we need. It will the tricky question before Chris jumps in on this, it comes down to will be resources. And in Josh McAllister's original review, he talked about £2.5 billion, and it doesn't feel like that's a possibility at this moment in time. But that £2.5 billion wasn't about just chuck £2.5 billion at it. It was £2.5 billion to stop you wasting 10 billion. So if you think about everything that we've said about kids not going into external residential placements where their needs aren't met effectively, and very high cost placements with poor outcomes, the £2.5 billion investment is an investment to save and to improve outcomes for children. So I do think that supporting local authorities and their partners and the third sector and communities to set up the right services is necessary for this model to come off.
So, Chris, perhaps you could pick up some of that as well. I'm thinking a lot of this is about the balance between the need to help and support families who are in the sort of positions that we've talked about, and then the need to protect children, the sort of balance in that with the need to protect children from harm. And we've talked about the 90%, which is probably that former group, and the 10%, which is...
Yeah.
How have you achieved that balance, or are achieving that balance in Darlington?
I think that the first thing I would say, John, is whilst that there's the 90-10, that I don't think we can see the two as entirely separate, because if we don't provide appropriate early help and support, then the issues that families require help and support with can lead to children suffering harm, either accidentally or otherwise. So the two are intrinsically linked, but when we believe in that notion, we take the view that the more early help and support we provide, the less children suffering from significant harm we will find. If we take it, if we buy into that belief that the vast majority of children experiencing harm is as a consequence of those myriad of complicated factors for families that Sal described earlier, be it your poverty, your poor housing, parents having their own experiences of trauma growing up themselves and how that manifests. So if we take our view of help and support first and foremost, then we hold the nerve of putting the emphasis in there. I think we had the benefit of of Sal and his colleagues working alongside us and really sharing some of the success that they'd had to help us on the journey. But, I think it does take that element of bravery that you described, but it is absolutely culture. It's culture, culture, culture. We constantly talk about it. It is very much, do you as an organisation and your leaders and your political support, do they believe in this notion? And I go back to a kind of really simple bit of teaching that I had when I was first studying to be a social worker around, families being the experts of their own lives. And if we truly believe in that notion at the centre of it, then families are the best people to understand what the issues are and to come up with the solutions. But that does require an element of trust that is really important. I think my reflection on it is, and I get the privilege of speaking to our newly qualified social workers when they first join and talking to them about some of this stuff. And I'm yet to meet a social worker who gives me an impression that they've come into the organisation or that they've come into social work because they want to follow timescales or they want to come in and remove children. So there is that really challenging discourse for ourselves of, is it us institutionally as services that bring this through? So, when we talk about individuals in the organisation that don't really share our values and beliefs and culture around a family first approach and very much seeing, then I do think we need to challenge ourselves as us as organisations and a collective that have caused them to feel that way, because I don't think anybody sits at home and thinks, as they're pondering, do they want to get into social work or in children's services in general, that they want to do it for any other reason other than they want to improve the lives of the children and families. I have that core belief everyone comes into it for that. So there's the real challenge around constantly challenging those that don't share that view and where their behaviours and their approaches aren't consistent with that. And I think it's just it's a relentless approach and a constant challenge where we do see families not being valued in the way we want them to, but to seek and to understand that. And I would say it's a constant journey. We've, from a very early stage when we reflected with our colleagues and leads around the journey that we were going to go on with our practice, and Leeds colleagues were really open with us of saying, we've made significant inroads, improvements, we've transformed many areas of our practice, but this job will never be finished. It's a constant. We can always do more. If we think about it through a relational lens, you can always improve a relationship. You can always strengthen it. I don't think there's such a thing as a perfect relationship, whether that's a child-parent relationship, as a couple, as friends. You can always do more to strengthen and enrich in that. So I think if we think about the family valued process or the general approach of working in a relational way, either as an organisation or with families, it's not a start and an end point. It's a constant evolving journey. So I think in terms of how we do it, John, if you know the answer, tell me, because I don't have it. I think it's a constant drive, but culture is at the absolute centre and heart of it, and it needs a strong belief. And when I get the challenging questions, within my capacity, I have to have real belief that what we're doing is the right way to deliver services for children and families. And that's the only way, I think, to get through that challenge around it. Yeah,
and I think, as we all know, all relationships are different. And all families are different. I mean, God, don't we all know that? Can I ask about the broader environment of, so not just children's services, but services for children and working with partners? And so it sort of occurs to me, for this to be a success, for this approach to be a success, doesn't just involve a children's services department. It involves an entire city or county or lots of partners. What do you think about that, Gail? Is that am I right with that?
That's interesting, because 30 years ago, when I might have had a difficult relationship with a health visitor and she left and a new smiler health visitor come, and I thought, great, that's the partnership bit ticked, that's sorted. And what I now know at my advanced age is that the relationship with partners and the partnership is just, as Chris has just said, it's an absolute constant, that you have to work at that relationship, not have preconceived ideas, not have not let the difficulties of the differences get in the way. You know, for 30 years I have been working, you know, I sometimes joke in training or whatever that they'll put on my gravestone, she weren't able to sort this, you know, still difficulty with the police or whatever. But we're all very different. But we absolutely must work in partnership to help children. And sometimes we just don't know what other people do or can offer. And that, so working with partner, working on relationships is as important with individual agencies within the council, within health or probation. We absolutely have to work on that every single day. You have to smile and stroke, I mean, sort of virtually stroke, you know, say, when sometimes that is absolutely not what you want to do, and just keep working on that. And it's never, ever done. It's as important as working with families. And I think with family valued, sometimes we're kind of pushing at an open door that people want. You know, other agencies want sometimes social work, social care to work in a different way. So it's a constant, it's a space where you've got to keep trying and keep working on those relationships. It's an absolute in our profession, and it really is. It's so important.
And just to jump on a specific there for a moment. So in early help, family help, there's the early help practitioner, isn't there, role, which very often in around the country is a council person. But it doesn't need to be, does it?
It doesn't need to be, absolutely. It doesn't need to. I mean, you know, there's a lot we can all learn from the skill and knowledge. We once had the experience where an early help practitioner or family support worker went into a family and said, "How can I help?" And they actually said, and they'd had about 10 years of social work, nobody's ever said that to me before. And they often work alongside families. They're often from a health background, an educational background. Sometimes they're in schools with children all the time. So they're very skilled. They should never be called not qualified. It's not a thing. And also, I think there's some opportunities to make sure that there is a really good career advancement for them, because wouldn't it be great if we could have many more of those become social workers if that's what they want to do? But you know, voluntary sector, Home Start volunteers, absolutely, just the people who are so skilled and so committed to families, and the people who really help families, we've a lot to learn from them. We need to value them right the way across the board. I think we would probably say we just need some more of them. If resources were, it would be. But it's a great opportunity, and they should never be, you know, sort of diminished in the way that we speak about them or value them. Absolutely across the board, and so valuable to families.
I'm conscious that we're sort of approaching the end of this session, so I'm just going to go round and ask each of you for perhaps one thing you suggest colleagues listening to this might want to take from this discussion for their day-to-day work or their thinking. Perhaps Sal, I could start with you on that. Got your mic turned off.
Well spotted, John. Unsurprisingly, you know, I think the thing to concentrate on is relationships, and building relationships. You know, I think you know, the skills that we have in working with children and engaging families should be at the forefront of what we do, and then we can fill the form out within the time frame afterwards. But let's just start with that relationship stuff, and a bit like the stuff that Chris was saying, in order to ensure that we're in the best possible position to do that with children and families. Let's concentrate on some of those relationships that exist within our teams, within our organisations, and with our partners. Because if you start to make all of that relational, then the most critical bit in terms of the relationship with the child, relationship with the family, becomes that much easier.
Gail, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much really. I think if people look up their organisation and think, oh, it's okay listening to these, no, it's really difficult for me to have relational practice. I think I'm surprised Sal's not said this, but he's a quote I'll steal from him, which is, I can't remember, he'll tell me who it is, be the change that you want to see. Who is that, Sal?
It was only Gandhi.
That's it, right? I knew it was some important person, but you know, just do I work on relationships? Do I always visit when I say I'm visiting? Make the phone call? All of those things. Be welcoming. That doesn't mean to be soft or whatever, but be respectful. And the other thing I would say is always to say to people, who's in your network, who's in your wider family, who helps you, and is it okay if we talk to them? Do I bring them? Because we are very, very good at just talking to mothers. We don't even talk to dads very much of the time, but everybody has friends, mothers, aunties, uncles, and they are a great support to people. So don't ever just work with one person in a family.
Chris, do you want to round us off?
Yeah, I could echo either Sal or Gail's points really, but I suppose I'll take a slightly different angle then, and I suppose reflecting on all of this through the kind of stable homes built on love and the different pillars within that, but actually the first word in that for me is really key, which is stable. And so my messaging is probably from an organisational perspective, which is that, you know, the work that we do with children and families is often when they're in periods of crisis, turmoil, unpredictability, and you know, I said before, the real privilege of having this model that we do have is that we get to model that as leaders, the way that we want the behaviours to be with families, and I think stable is the start of it, and it echoes a bit of Gail's point that everyone can play their part in this, but how do we create the most stable children's service that we possibly can, because if we can model stability and calm, then we're most likely to be able to deliver the right type of support for children and families who are perhaps in a time that isn't the most stable at the minute. So I think that real focus on stability, John.
Thank you. I think we've had a really fulsome discussion there, and I hope that's given everybody a new perspective, or challenged your approach, or just given you something to think about. So some points I've taken from it: the focus on relationships, not only with children and families, but with colleagues and with partners. The need to balance help and support with child protection, and doing that in a way that does support families first and foremost, and getting that balance right. A whole system approach, and as Chris has said, stability, trust, and all those things that underpin what we're trying to do here in this discussion. So our advice is experience is here to make use of, so please get in touch if you want to have conversations beyond this. I'll circulate a copy of the webinar to share with colleagues afterwards, and drop me a line if you need anything. There's also a guide to family value that we can share a link to if you want to have a look at that. Finally, just to say thank you to Sal, to Chris, and to Gail, and thank you for your time, for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.